Hey everybody, welcome back to Mark's Action Figures. Today we're diving into a really unique group of DC Direct figures that span some of the biggest and most creative Superman-related storylines from the 2000s. We've got All-Star Superman Collector Set Bizarro, Bizarro from Superman Series 1, Red Sun Bizarro from the Elseworlds Red Sun box set, Superboy Prime from Infinite Crisis Series 1, Crisis on Infinite Earths Series 3 Superboy, Big Barda from New Gods Series 2, Brainiac from Superman, New Krypton, and Brainiac from History of the DC Universe Series 3. This was an era where DC Direct really focused on comic accuracy, sculpt, quality, and bringing major storylines directly onto collectors' shelves. So today we're going to take a look at the comic history behind these characters, the figures themselves, and whether these releases still hold up today. So let's get started. All-Star Superman Collector Set Bizarro from 2011. Look at this guy. Bizarro has been one of Superman's most recognizable villains since his very first appearance in Superboy number 68. Originally created as a flawed duplicate of Superboy, Bizarro evolved into a tragic and often misunderstood character whose backwards logic and imperfect nature made him both a threat and a source of comic relief. The version represented by this figure comes from the acclaimed All-Star Superman series by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. In this story, Superman faces a variety of extraordinary challenges while confronting his own mortality. The Bizarro world and its inhabitants are portrayed as twisted reflections of Superman's ideals, emphasizing themes of imperfection, identity, and the strange mirror image that Bizarro represents. The All-Star version of Bizarro retains the character's signature backward nature, but adopts this distinctive artistic style that made the series one of the most celebrated Superman stories ever published. The result is a Bizarro that looks simultaneously familiar and unsettling, perfectly fitting the tone of the All-Star universe. Now, this figure, if you look at it closely, you'll see right away that DC Direct did an excellent job of translating Frank Quitely's unique artwork into three-dimensional form. The figure immediately stands out with its chalky, pale complexion, exaggerated facial features, and rough, imperfect appearance. The head sculpt is one of the strongest aspects of the figure. The vacant expression, uneven facial structure, and weathered texture help capture the strange and tragic nature of Bizarro. Unlike traditional Superman figures that emphasize perfection and heroism, this sculpt intentionally feels flawed and, distorted. The costume faithfully recreates the all-star design, including the iconic reversed chest emblem and simplified suit details. The muted paint applications and rough textures further reinforce the character's imperfect clone origins. Articulation is typical for DC Direct releases from this era, offering enough movement for basic display poses while prioritizing sculpt accuracy. Collectors will likely appreciate this figure most as a display piece rather than an action-oriented toy. Overall, this is one of the most visually distinctive Bizarro figures DC Direct produced and an essential companion piece of any All-Star Superman collection. Next up, we have Bizarro Superman Series 1 from 2007. So again, as an imperfect duplicate of Superman, and depending on the version, he's either a failed clone, a distorted artificial art form, or a backward reflection of Superman himself. What makes Bizarro fascinating is that he's tragic. He often wants friendship or acceptance, but interprets everything in reverse. In many stories, Bizarro even speaks backwards and uses opposite logic. So instead of saying good, he says bad. Instead of helping correctly, he accidentally causes destruction. Some versions of Bizarro are comedic, and while others are just genuinely unsettling. This DC Direct figure really emphasizes the creepy side of Bizarro. The pale skin, cracked facial sculpt, and awkward posture makes him look unstable and unnatural. And he is bulky as hell. I mean, he's one of the most bulky Bizarros I've ever seen. I love the torn costume details because it reinforces the idea that he's an imperfect Superman. I love the chains around his wrist. I mean, he just looks like he's ready to cause absolute mayhem and chaos. The face sculpt especially, to me, stands out. There's sadness to it while also looking monstrous. The balance is important for Bizarro because underneath the chaos, there's often a character who doesn't fully understand what he's doing wrong. For collectors, this is still one of the best comic-based Bizarro figures ever made. Certainly the most bulky and menacing Bizarros. Next up is Red Sun Bizarro from Elseworlds Red Sun box set in 2008. Now, this one is especially interesting. This is the Red Sun version of Bizarro based on Superman Red Sun by Mark Millar. For anyone unfamiliar with the Red Sun, this is the story that asks one major question. What if Superman rocket landed in the Soviet Union instead of Kansas? It's one of the greatest Elseworlds stories DC ever published. In that universe, Bizarro was essentially created by the United States as an attempt to counter Soviet Superman. But unlike the traditional Bizarro, this version was more tragic and unstable, almost Frankenstein-like. The design intentionally looked disturbing and incomplete. This figure is creepy in the best possible way. The chalk white skin and distorted features make him look like a failed experiment. The sculpted veins and body texture are excellent. And honestly, this may be one of the most horror-inspired Superman-related figures DC Direct ever released. The box set itself has become highly collectible because Red Sun remains such a beloved Superman story. This version of Bizarro stands apart from the regular release because it feels less goofy and far more tragic. It almost feels like a monster figure from a science fiction horror comic. Next up, we have Superboy Prime Infinite Crisis Series 1 from 2006. Now we move into one of the most controversial and dangerous characters in DC history, Superboy Prime. Superboy Prime originally came from Earth Prime, which was basically meant to represent our reality, a world where superheroes only existed in comic books. After the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, he disappeared from continuity for years. But in Infinite Crisis, DC brought him back in a major way. And instead of being an innocent young hero, he became bitter and violent. Superboy blamed the modern DC universe for becoming darker and morally corrupted. What made him terrifying was that he had essentially the power level of Silver Age Superman with almost no restraint. This is the character who literally punched reality. Think about that. He punched reality. That's pretty strong. That's not even an exaggeration. DC used him as a symbol of toxic nostalgia and obsession with the perfect past version of comics. The figure captures that exaggerated rage extremely well. The sculpt is aggressive, especially for facial expression and body posture. The costume is deceptively simple, but the darker shading gives it more intense look than a standard Superboy design. One thing I love about DC Direct during this period is that they often based figures directly on specific comic artists' interpretations. You can really see the Infinite Crisis aesthetic here. This articulation is, of course, limited by today's standards, but visually this figure still looks fantastic on a shelf, especially if you display him fighting Superman or alongside other Crisis-era characters. Now, next up, we have Crisis on Infinite Earths Series 3 Superboy from 2006. So, Superboy represents the adventures of Superman during his teenage years in Smallville, long before becoming Earth's greatest hero. Throughout the Silver Age, Superboy was a central figure in DC Comics and frequently teamed up with the Legion of Superheroes while learning the responsibilities that would eventually define Superman. The particular figure pictured here is inspired by the landmark crossover event Crisis on Infinite Earths, published between 1985 and 1986. The series was created by Marv Wolfman and George Perez and remains one of the most important stories in comic book history. One of the emotional highlights of the story involved Superboy, an Earth Prime, a character who originally came from a reality where superheroes existed only in comic books. Following the events of Crisis, the concept of Superboy became deeply intertwined with DC's evolving multiverse and continuity changes. The Crisis storyline permanently altered the DC universe and established a new foundation for decades of stories that followed. Because of this historical significance, Crisis of Infinite Earths remains a cornerstone of DC lore and is often regarded as one of the greatest crossover events ever published. Now, Crisis on Infinite Earth Series 3 Superboy figure showcases the classic Silver Age appearance that many longtime fans remember from comics from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The sculpt represents a youthful version of Superman, featuring a slimmer build and cleaner facial features that most adult Superman figures would have. The youthful appearance helps distinguish the figure while still maintaining the familiar Kryptonian look. The costume is instantly recognizable, featuring the traditional Superman shield, red trunks, yellow belt, red boots, and flowing cape. The bright colors accurately capture the optimistic style of the Silver Age and reflects the era from which Superboy originated. Paint applications are clean and vibrant, helping the figure stand out among darker and more modern interpretations of Superman characters. The cape drapes naturally and contributes to the classic heroic silhouette. As many DC Direct figures of this period, articulation is somewhat limited by today's standards. Thinking of McFarlane here, of course. But the sculpt and presentation more than compensate. This figure was clearly designed to celebrate a significant moment in DC history and serves as a tribute to one of the company's most enduring young heroes. For collectors of Superman memorabilia and Crisis on Infinite Earths merchandise, this Superboy remains an important and nostalgic addition to any display. All right, next up is Big Barda from the New Gods Series 2 from 2009. So, one of the most powerful female characters in the DC universe. Big Barda was created by Jack Kirby during his legendary Fourth World saga in the early 1970s. Kirby introduced an entirely new mythology into DC Comics with the worlds of New Genesis and Apocalypse. Barda was originally raised on Apocalypse under the rule of Darkseid and trained as the leader of the Female Furies, an elite group of warriors. But eventually she rebelled against Darkseid and meeting Mr. Miracle, also known as Scott Free. What made Big Barda so interesting was the contrast in her character. She was this towering, intimidating warrior with immense strength, but she also had humanity, loyalty, and compassion. She became one of the defining cosmic characters in the DC history. Now, this figure absolutely captures the Kirby-inspired aesthetic. DC Direct was known for prioritizing sculpt detail over articulation, and you could really see that here. The armor is massive and detailed. The sculpted textures, shoulder pads, and helmet all feel ripped directly from a comic panel. The proportions are powerful, which is exactly how Big Barda should look. She's not meant to appear delicate. She's supposed to look like someone who could fight Superman. The face sculpt is also surprisingly good for that era. One thing collectors still appreciate about DC Direct figures is how stylized and comic accurate they were compared to the more toyetic lines. This figure feels like a collectible statue with articulation, as most DC Direct figures would. Next up is Brainiac from Superman New Krypton Series 1 in 2010. Finally, we have another version of Brainiac from New Krypton storyline. This New Krypton era was one of DC's biggest Superman events in the late 2000s. After the city of Kandor was restored to full size, Superman suddenly found himself connected to an entire civilization of Kryptonians. That changed everything. Instead of being the last son of Krypton, he became one of Kryptonian among thousands. Brainiac played a major role in that storyline because of his historical connection to Kandor. The modern versions of Brainiac during this era became more monstrous and technologically evolved. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was almost a living machine civilization. Compared to the earlier Brainiac figures, this one feels more aggressive and alien. The armor is much heavier. The sculpt is sharper and more mechanical. You can really see DC moving toward a more intimidating modern interpretation of the character. The green metallic finish works beautifully under lighting, especially on display shelves. Once again, DC Direct's sculpting team absolutely nailed the comic book accuracy. This figure feels like it walked directly off the page. And finally, Brainiac, History of the DC Universe Series 3 from 2009. So this is one of Superman's greatest enemies, as I've stated before. Brainiac first appeared in Action Comics in 1958 and has gone through many redesigns over the decades. Originally, he was portrayed as an alien android scientist obsessed with collecting knowledge and cities. One of the darkest parts of his mythology is the bottled city of Kandor. Brainiac shrunk the whole state, and he stole the whole city of Kandor from Krypton before the planet exploded, preserving it as part of his collection. The concept alone made him terrifying because Brainiac doesn't conquer worlds emotionally like Lex Luthor or Darkseid. He sees civilizations as specimens. Over time, DC evolved Brainiac into more of a cold artificial intelligence, almost machine-like in his obsession with perfection and control. So this version of Brainiac has that classic modern look from the late 2000s. The green skin tone, exposed circuitry, and armored biomechanical design work just does him justice. DC Direct absolutely excelled at alien textures and cybernetic sculpting. The metallic paint applications still hold up surprisingly well today. I especially like the facial sculpt because it features that emotionless, calculating expression Brainiac is known for. You can almost picture him analyzing Superman while deciding whether Earth is worth preserving or, hell, destroying. This figure also scales nicely with DC Direct Superman figures from the same era. So, overall, this lineup perfectly represents why so many collectors still love DC Direct figures. These weren't designed primarily as toys. They were designed as physical comic art. The sculpts were bold, dramatic, and highly faithful to the source material. And what makes this group especially fun is the variety of storytelling represented here. Cosmic mythology with Big Barda, artificial intelligence horror with Brainiac, multiverse destruction with Superboy Prime, tragic mirror image storytelling with Bizarro, and alternate universe political commentary with Red Sun. This era of DC Comics was experimental, ambitious, and visually unique, and DC Direct really captured that energy. So, guys, let me know in the comments which one of these figures is your favorite. And what's your favorite DC Direct line of all time? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Mark's Action Figures. I will see you in the next review.